Whether it's the end of the year or the middle of the year, it doesn't really matter. SOP reviews or reviews of policies and procedures need to occur. It is important that we review these policies, procedures, or SOPs, as you might call them, because it ensures that there are relevance and effectiveness in your organization or company when it comes to SOPs. It also ensures that you identify outdated and unnecessary processes or even unnecessary procedures in these SOPs and things that might be just simply outdated. It can enhance your efficiency and productivity, and it can reduce errors and inconsistencies, and finally improve compliance and risk management. So in this episode, I'm going to go through with you the review process of reviewing your SOPs, and moving forward I'll just be saying SOPs, but know that they include all policies and procedures, as you might call them, in your organization. And let's go through, I've just given you the reasons why it's so important to do it, but now I'm going to give you the how. Let's do it.
Leading as a woman is tough, but leading as a woman of faith is next level. However, it doesn't have to be that way. God has called you into this leadership role because He says you are worthy. You are His child, and if He qualifies you, who in this world can unqualify you? You might suffer from imposter syndrome and believe you're not good enough, but God says you are good enough. Hi, I'm Rika, Whelan, Christian leader and workplace culture coach, and together we're going to navigate leadership with faith as our foundation. Let's get started. Grab your coffee or water, keep that notebook and pen handy, and let's jumpstart your leadership.
As I mentioned before, SOPs can become outdated very, very quickly, and that it could happen right under your nose as well. There can be a simple discussion in a leadership meeting or in a executive meeting, and then what is missed is often the update of the SOP. So what I liked to do was I liked to do annual updates. In particular, some of your more used SOPs got updated on an annual basis, or if you've got SOPs that are more standard, especially if it's industry standard and something has to be done according to an industry versus just the organization, then those got reviewed biannually. So now, before I go through the whole review process, a little tip that I'd like to give you is that throughout the year, you might wait until you update those SOPs on an annual basis, meaning once a year, okay? But throughout the year, as you notice things that need updating, write them in a notebook. So that can be a physical notebook or it can be a digital notebook. The other thing you could do is, if you've got Microsoft Teams, you can create a channel where you just say suggested policy and procedure updates, and then you can have your team suggest updates to policies and procedures as they experience them, for example. So before I jump the gun, but that's just a little tip that I figured out after a couple of years of reviewing policies and procedures on an annual basis. I figured there's no use in going once a year through those SOPs and then thinking, what needs to change, when I've already actually thought about 5 things that need to change, but I didn't write them down. So there's a little tip for you, is get a specific place where you start noting those changes to SOPs throughout the year, so that when you do get to those changes, you are aware and you know what kind of things need to change. Now, you have a choice. So if you're the person that does the reviews of the SOPs, like I was, you can definitely form a review team. Okay, so you can form a team to help you with this, or you can simply still get people involved, but then you're the one that does all the updates in the end. It kind of just depends on how the business is structured, how many people there are, and specifically, in some organizations, you might be the preferred person that have to do it, and therefore you can't formally include somebody in a review team, but you might want to do that informally, or like I mentioned before, is you can have your team or people across the organization share some suggestions on how these policies or why these policies need to be updated. So you can identify key stakeholders in your organization. So this can be anybody from board members to team members to heads of department who can be part of this review team. Or if it's not officially going to be a review team, you can maybe send out an email, or you can maybe send out a Teams message to say annual updates of SOPs are coming up. If you've got any suggestions for any SOPs that need updating, please let me know. Or if you can't think of anything right now, but you come across something in the future, please add it to this team's channel or to this digital notebook. That might be a shared notebook, or just email it straight to me. So again, that might be how you do it, especially if you don't have a review team at that point in time, or if you can't afford, because I know some organizations, if they're awarded those additional duties, then they need to earn like a income above and beyond their base salary. So, I mean, if that's not something that can happen, again, you can just ask people to send you through some suggestions throughout the year. And then these could be key stakeholders. Again, it could be team members, heads of departments, board members, because remember, board of directors have their own policies and SOPs as well. So yeah, it can be really anybody all the way up to the CEO, all the way down to the person who sorts the mail. So there's no really, in terms of hierarchy, who can or cannot be involved. But also it's important that when you are doing the review of your SOPs, that you consider a diverse perspective. Because remember, if it's just you that give your perspective on the change of SOPs, then it could be biased. And the things that you might want to implement, without you knowing it, it could actually benefit you, but not necessarily everyone in the organization. And so something like that is definitely not something that you'll do on purpose unless it is on purpose and unless you want to change something for your own benefit. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend that. Remember, we want to do the right thing all the time, whether somebody's looking or not. And in particular, when it comes to SOPs, people will be looking at those SOPs and then wondering why has this update happened. And so, yes, there might be a more official process where you work, definitely. But if there is not an official process in terms of how policies and procedures are reviewed, then yeah, this is a good one. So number one is form a review team. And then if you can't do a team, just get other people involved in on how that's done. Other stakeholders, like I said, there could be lots of various people. And then when you do form a review team, so let's say you are lucky enough that you can have a team, what my suggestion would be is to, in the group itself or in the review team, assign specific roles and responsibilities. So remember, any good team or any member of if you're part of a leadership team, or if you have those meetings, then somebody has to chair those meetings. So be sure that somebody is always chairing those meetings and taking full responsibility and making sure that the team stays on track. But then also, for example, you could have one person doing minutes of the meeting. You could have another person transferring those minutes and those suggested changes onto the actual document with track changes so that others can have a look and approve of it. Or you could have somebody gather all the information from all the various stakeholders and then bring it to you where you make those changes. So maybe if you just have one person who assists you in working through these SOP changes, especially if you're a bigger organization and there are quite a lot of SOPs, then you do want to avoid you being the only person who is working through that, because that will take you about a month of every single year just reviewing all the SOPs. And so that's what it literally looked like to me. Is I didn't have a team. necessarily a review team per se, but what I had was my leadership team. So on an annual basis, I would suggest to the team that it's now SOP updates, and we need to work through this. So what we did is, yes, we did have a channel where people could suggest changes on Microsoft Teams. And throughout the year, as SOPs were used and we realized that something was outdated, I would add it to a Microsoft OneNote, specifically under that policy and procedure. So every SOP had its own OneNote tab, and then I would add those suggested changes. But then on an annual basis, when I sat with my leadership team, we would take the most used SOPs, and those are the ones we would work through together as a team. We would work through them and we would suggest changes, even if it was a change in language, because like for example, in the last couple of years, the word psychological safety came out. But that doesn't mean that psychological safety didn't exist before, but it's not a word that we utilized in our SOPs because it's not a word that existed. But in the meantime, the word psychological safety came out, and so therefore we updated our SOPs to include the word psychological safety. So that's what I mean. So even if it's just including new jargon, new words, new things that come out, it's also important that you and your review team, or then my leadership team, for example, would stay up to date with what was going on within the industry or with trends, or we would make some suggestions. The other thing that we would always do, well, not always, but we would also think about what are other companies in our industry doing. And sometimes we even would bring those to the table and say, okay, this company in this SOP is actually doing this, and the reason why we know that is because somebody in the leadership team used to work for that company. Well, we think that that's a really good idea. How can we apply to our organization? And then how do we want to change the SOP, not to copy and paste what they are doing, but because that's a really good idea, how can we apply it to us and then make that happen? So that was something that we did as well. And that's the really good part about considering diverse perspectives when you've got a team doing it instead of just you, because you are just you and you've only worked at the places that you've worked. But if you include other stakeholders and a team or other people, whether it's just the leadership team or heads of department, then you just bring other perspectives. So that's really good. So the second thing that you're going to do is you're going to assess the current documentation. So review your existing SOPs, your existing policies and procedures, and all of those documentations, and then identify the gaps, the inconsistencies, and the redundancies, and then also evaluate them for clarity and understandability. Because remember, again, things change over the years. And so a terminology that might have been used before is not a terminology that you use now, or you need to update because there's, for example, a really good example is all these things that have come out with gender equality. And so, all SOPs might only say, let's for example say, there we go, I can think of the dress policy. So if your organization wanted to include gender fluidity, for example, in your SOPs. And so again, remember, this is not my opinion. It's not my personal opinion. I'm just giving an example of something that might have not been there 5 years ago, but now needs to be included because of things that have happened in the world. Okay. So let's say, for example, gender fluidity. The dress code at one of my previous organizations clearly said dress code for females, dress code for males. And so, somebody in the organization or the CEO or the board of directors might feel that that's not gender inclusive. We want to change it to, I don't know. Again, this is a difficult one because we didn't have this in my organization. We didn't change it to include gender, be more gender inclusive. So yeah, but I'm just trying to give an example of maybe you want to change that. So maybe go and think, okay, if we had somebody who comes to the organization who didn't identify as a male or a female, what are we going to do? Like, are we going to, because they're a really good worker, they've got great, excellent qualifications and skills, and we really want them in the organization. But then let's say a year later, this person brings up, so they didn't make a fuss at the beginning of their time working there, but maybe now they're more comfortable. They bring to the table that they don't feel, let's say they're on the review team, they don't feel that the dress policy is gender inclusive. What would you do? So these types of questions need to be answered. These types of questions need to be thought about. And what are we going to do? I'm not saying we have to go and change all our policies and procedures to include every single little thing that happens in the world, because to be honest, there's so many things going on in the world. If we had to include every single little thing, then I think we would, it would be tough. I think it would be really tough, to be honest, because if you think about everything that's happened in the world over the last 5 years, then probably all our SOPs have to change. I'm not saying we have to be unreasonable about it, but I'm just saying, okay, let's start thinking about what are we going to include and what not. Okay, so assess your current documentation specifically for those things, like identify the gaps, the inconsistency, the redundancies, and then evaluate the clarity and understandability. From there, you're going to conduct a gap analysis. So basically, with the gap analysis, is you're going to compare your current practices in the industry to best practices. So let's say, for example, your organization does a practice that is really outdated, for example, and the industry in the meantime industry heads have in the meantime suggested an update. Well, then the update is actually the best practice, and your current practice is actually not up to date with that. So then you're really going to have to go and consider, how will we change that? And so an example that I have of this is just in the childcare industry, for example, somebody who I've spoken to. For example, there was an update in how nappies were changed, for example, in the industry. And so a simple little change was made, but then that affected it literally affected every single childcare centre in Australia because of that one little change that was made. And so now it meant that obviously all SOPs had to be changed, but also, never mind the fact that the SOP had to change, you had thousands of educators doing nappy changes on a daily basis, and all of a sudden they had to add this one thing. And so there was a lot of confusion, there was a lot of frustration because it had to change industry-wide. And will you believe this one little thing that changed was just putting a paper towel underneath the baby's bottom when changing the nappy. And so previously they didn't do that. Previously, they would, wash their hands, glove up, change the nappy, put the gloves in and the dirty nappy in the bin, put the new nappy, clean nappy on, and then put the baby's clothes back on. Whereas now what they had to do is, before even taking the baby's clothes off, to change the nappy, they had to put a paper towel underneath so that the surface that the baby's nappy is changed on doesn't get as dirty or as infected with, if the baby's got a soiled nappy, and let's say they've got potential for gastro or diarrhea, then the surface area is more protected. Still, they did clean it before and after, but there was this one little change ages ago. And so people felt really frustrated with this addition of the paper towel. And so all the organizations started to say, well, okay, we've got to, add the paper towel under the baby's bottom. Some companies were fighting against it because they felt that it was because of sustainability. People fought back against it because now that was an addition, lack of sustainability towards what everybody else was doing before, where you were not using the paper towel. So it was interesting. It was an interesting time. It was actually this was actually before I even came to Australia where this happened. And so when I spoke to somebody who was working in the childcare industry, they told me, who had actually been in the industry for years, how it affected them. There's been other changes as well that they mentioned, from curriculum changes to new implementations of national quality standards and things like that. And so yes, things in industries change all the time. And so it's not just things that happen in your organization, it's also things in the industry. So you really do need to go and conduct a gap analysis to understand what are these gaps, what are the industry's best practices, and then what are where do we need to improve? What are the changes that we need to make? But again, if only you as one person are going to be making these changes, that's a lot of homework for you to try and keep up to date with what's going on in the industry, to figure out like what's best practice. So that's why I really, really would suggest that you don't do this alone. If you are alone, then come up with a really good system. Let's say, for example, you could subscribe to some of your best industry companies to make sure that any industry updates you get by email, then that email you could save it under suggested for SOP updates. So you save that email under there, and so then in future you can come back to that email again. Believe me, you're not going to find that email in a year's time or in 8 or 9 months time, because then that's going to be like 1,000 or 2,000 emails later, depending on how many emails you get, and then you're just going to forget about it. So come up with a really good system where you and your review partner or your another stakeholder in the company can work together to keep up to date with what needs to change. It's going to make the gap analysis also so much easier for you. And then the fourth thing you want to do is update and revise. So sometimes we want to make sure that our SOPs have simplified language, and I did actually mention the word jargon before, where you want to make sure that you update the relevant language. So that's basically what I meant. But don't use too much jargon in your SOP, because you also want to make sure that when somebody reads that SOP, they know exactly what they're talking about. So one policy that I've seen once from a company was a SOP with a lot of abbreviations and a lot of acronyms. And so, yes, abbreviations and acronyms are fine if you work in the company. But if you are a new person who is starting in that company and you read those abbreviations and acronyms for the very first time, you are not going to have a clue. So if you do have a lot of acronyms and abbreviations, fine, because it saves a lot on word count and it saves a lot on paper. It can take your pages down from 5 to 4 pages. Or even 3 pages maybe, depending on how many there are. But then just make sure that at the top of every single page, or at the bottom of every single page, maybe there's a footnote, or at the top there's maybe a key where they can go and find what those abbreviations or acronyms stand for. It does sound tedious to do it at the top or at the bottom of every page, but that would really be my suggestion, just for ease of access. Okay. And then you can also add visuals and flowcharts into your SOPs. So especially for procedures where it's step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, where step 4 cannot be done if step 3 is not done, then a flowchart is actually a really good idea, because then what you could do is you could have the option of having those flowcharts separately. So they're in the SOP, but people can also download them separately, laminate them, and put them up on a board next to their desk. So having those flowcharts available, because remember, a 5 or 6 page SOP is not something that somebody's going to want to stick on their wall to remember the exact steps, especially if they're new. But a flowchart's really good idea for that. And remember, the flowchart only needs a couple of words to remind them what that actual step is. If they need more information, they can refer to the SOP. And then remember to update references and links in your SOP. So on an annual basis, make sure if there's links to outside pages, for example, industry pages, make sure that those links work, because they update those links and will not tell people that they have updated those links. Okay. So this has happened to me personally, where every single year I would go and update those links, and every single year they would work. And so the 4th year of me updating SOPs, by the 4th year they had updated those links, and if you navigated to them, then you wouldn't find what you were looking for. The other reason why we made sure that we updated our links was some of our customers, actually, well, all of our customers really, had access to some of our SOPs because they were customer forward. Not all SOPs were customer forward, but some of them were. And so that meant that we had to make sure that our links worked, because you can't refer a customer to a link and then the link doesn't work. It's just going to cause you a headache, because all that the customer is then going to do is contact you and say, hey, this link in the SOP doesn't work. So yeah, save yourself the time, and just make sure on an annual basis that all the links work. This is also a job you can give to an assistant or or an administrator, is to quickly go and jump on and just check those links. Okay. And then ensure that there's consistency with organizational goals and values. So, I mean, that's kind of obvious, where you're not going to want to say one thing in one SOP and then something completely different in another SOP. But I mean, really, I'm at the point where I'm not allowing you to assume anything. Don't assume that there's going to be consistency between SOPs. You need to go and check that there's consistency in language, consistency in practices, and if the one SOP say you have to do A, then the next one has to say you have to do A as well. It can't say B, C, or D, because then there's confusion between the SOPs. And also what works really well is if you link SOPs to each other. So if you know that an SOP is followed by another SOP, then write it at the end of that SOP. Say now, please refer to, let's say that you've got numbers for your SOPs. So let's say at the end of number 4, you're going to say refer to number 5 for further information regarding X, Y, and Z, whatever that might be. Now, if you do make changes to your SOPs, it is absolutely vital and crucial that you send out communication to your team and to your customers, if it's customer forward, that you have made these updates to your SOPs. So if it's minor changes, you can afford to only send out a detailed email about these changes. However, if it's more than just a couple of changes, you're going to have to sit your team down and you're going to have to do a training, especially if it's an SOP change. For example, there's now step 5 is now a brand new step that they've never done before. Like the paper towel situation, which is such a silly example, but for the childcare industry, it meant a lot, and they were very frustrated by that. And some of you in the nursing industry might actually, I've got a lot of listeners in the nursing industry. You might understand if in nursing you're following an SOP and the next moment there's a new step that you need to take. In any industry for that matter, it's frustrating. It can be really, really frustrating. And so, train your team up in that. And if they make a mistake, you're obviously going to be patient with them, but I would give them a couple of chances to get it right. And if after that, then you can start addressing the fact that they've missed those steps. But they are going to miss it in the beginning, so you're going to have to be patient. But teams can also work together to remind each other. So depending again on how big the change is, you can develop training materials and conduct a training session. And remember to communicate the changes effectively to all stakeholders. So I just mentioned customers and then your staff. But again, does the board of directors need to get involved? Who else needs to get involved? Okay. Sponsors, if you've got sponsors for your company, do they need to get involved? And then provide ongoing support and answer any questions regarding these updates. Okay. So here's a couple of tips for effective reviews. You want to involve the right people. So seek input from employees at all levels. Set clear objectives. So define the goals of the the review process. So especially if you've got a team and it's like a project, you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page with the review of the SOPs. And then prioritize your reviews. So prioritize SOPs. So you want to prioritize the SOPs that are used most. Okay, so those ones that are used by your team members or your employees on a daily basis, or especially those ones that are customer forward as well. You want to make sure that you prioritize those versus those ones that are dusty and maybe happens once in a blue moon type of situation. So, and then you can also use technology to review for your reviews. So again, like I mentioned, there's a couple of things that you can use like Microsoft Teams or OneNote. And with Microsoft Word, what you can do is, if those changes are made, make sure that you put the track changes in Microsoft Word on so that anybody can see what those changes are. So a suggestion with the track changes that I've done in the past is you simply send the track changes document to your employees so that they can see exactly what was changed in the document. Okay, everybody can then have a say in the changes that was made, and then after that the document is finalized and then the final updated version is sent to everybody. So the track changes one is also good because if you keep the track changes on, people can see exactly what updates have been made. Then they don't have to worry about that. And that saves you that additional step of having to go write everything up additionally about what has changed. So this will replace, for example, your email. You can still email this document, of course, but it'll save you the time of having to go and write it out in an email exactly what was changed. And so just make sure that reviews are done on a regular basis, and that it's not that it doesn't happen only biannually, or only every 3 years, or only every 4 years, or only when there's been a significant change in the industry. You have to review them on an annual basis to make sure that they are current and relevant. And so some common pitfalls that I'd like for you to avoid, and I'm going to end off with that, is rushing the process. So don't rush through the whole process of reviewing the SOPs, because if you rush through it, something might be missed. Don't overcomplicate the procedure, okay? Keep it simple and straightforward. Don't make it overcomplicated. You handle that as a project. This on the month of November, we're doing SOPs. This is what we're going to do from step A to step Z, okay? Don't neglect employee input. Please listen to your people, okay? The people who work with the SOPs, the people who does the job, okay? You might do it as well, but listen to them, give them input. People love having input and knowing that a change on a permanent document is because they made the suggestion. And then failing to follow up. So, for example, if employees have let you know that there's a significant change, or any change for that matter, needed in an SOP, and you just don't follow up on that, or you make the change in the SOP, saying that the additional step is that you as the mid-manager is going to follow up, and then you never follow up. You don't follow the SOP yourself. So that is definitely a big pitfall that you can fall into. And think about this. If you're making those changes, does it really need to change? What's going to be the significant impact if we make this change, or can it stay the same? So just ask yourself these common sense questions. Think about what are the consequences going to be of these changes. Does it really need to change, or can it stay the same? Because remember, not all things that stay the same is always good. Change can be as good as a holiday, okay? And at work, change can be good. It can also mean less work. If some things are made more efficient, more effective, or if some steps are simply cut out because they're additional and they don't need to happen. Okay, well, at the end of this episode, I would like to share with you some good news that I finished my MBA degree, and that's so exciting. I'm waiting for my final results now and my letter to invite me to graduation. But I am done. I've finished and I've submitted my final research paper. This last term, I had 5 assignments that had to be in because I did double units or double subjects so that I could finish with my MBA. Otherwise, it would have meant that I'd only have finished at the end of March. But I was keen to finish up so I can focus more on this podcast and on the show for 2025 and on everything that God wants me to do through the show. So if you have time available and you can speak to me about the podcast, I've got 4 questions that you can answer for me. I'd really love it if you could take some time to speak to me. I'm not going to be selling you anything. That's not the point. The point is just to ask you a couple of questions so that I can ensure that I tailor this podcast to you, the listener. And so if you have the time, please email me. You can actually just click. There's a link that I'll include at the bottom of the show notes, and it'll go straight to my email. You can just email me and say, I can help with the 4 questions. And 4 questions, no more than that. I might have a couple of follow-up questions if I need clarity on anything. But other than that, I just want to ask you some questions as the listener, and so that I can make sure that this is tailored to you, that it serves you better. And I'm planning on, maybe in a week or 2, I'm planning on spending some time with the Lord praying for the podcast for 2025. And I'd absolutely love your input in what that might look like. So you don't need to think about anything. I'm just going to ask you some questions about you, about your leadership role, and about some struggles that you might be having, so that I can use them as future podcast episodes and to push the direction of the podcast into a place where I serve you as women of faith in leadership the best. So if you've got some time, I'd really appreciate it. It won't take longer than about 15 minutes, but I know everyone's busy towards the end of the year. If you're listening to this episode in January, I'd still love to chat with you. The more I can speak to the listeners, the better, because that means I can really tailor the show to suit the listeners. Okay, well, I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll chat to you again next week. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening. If this podcast blessed you in some way, the number one way you can thank me is by leaving a review. Your feedback means the world to me and lights me up every single time when I read it, and it makes me want to keep going. So please leave a review, and your review will also help other Christian women in leadership find the answers they are looking for. So whether you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, scroll down to the review section and leave that review. Then head over to womenoffaithinleadership.com and join our free Facebook community, and I look forward to engaging with you there.